everybody. Dr. Rob Silverman, Proven Health Alternatives. I have world-renowned doctor, professor, brain researcher, best-selling author, Dr. Rob Melillo. I'm excited to have him. This guy is definitely going to elevate your knowledge on functional neurology. Doc, pleasure.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, I'm excited. I'm ready to delve in. So let me ask you, what is this idea of functional neurology and how does it affect children, teenagers, and young adults alike?
Well, the idea behind it is that, when you look at many neurological symptoms, and if you look at a lot of things out there that even haven't traditionally been looked at as neurological symptoms, they are often related to that. So, we know that most people that have neurological issues, whether they're developmental, they're almost always developmental, but, whether they're things like ADD, ADHD, or whether they're other types of neurologically related things, that, there isn't really a lot of clear-cut answers there. And in traditional medicine, they really look at symptoms and symptom management. So just like the way functional medicine developed, that whole came about with Jeff Bland and early people basically looking at saying, we're just looking at symptom management, but we're moving towards chronic issues and chronic health issues. And we need to do more than just manage symptoms. We need to look at, can we prevent them or can we reverse them by knowing what the normal functional measurements and lab work should be and trying to target and get people there. So in neurology, it was the same thing. Many people have these neurological symptoms and they're trying to address them. But, the idea was that we don't want to just address symptoms. We want to say, well, what's actually happening? What is the actual problem, and how do we measure those neurological functions and try to get people into the optimal functional range rather than just managing their symptoms? And that was the idea of functional neurology. It really started with trying to understand what is actually happening in the brain and the nervous system, and then how does that relate to the symptoms, and then how do we come up with therapies to get people into those targeted functional ranges and use functional measurements to guide the therapy rather than just symptom management.
Now, that's music to my ears, root cause resolution, not symptom management, finding out what system is going. So you're taxing the system through neurological stimuli. You have created your own method. Now, I know it, meaning I've heard about it. It's lauded in our field. You do a great job. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate that. It's always great to talk to somebody who's elevated the field and elevated healthcare. Within that, the Melillo method, I know you have a couple of things where you refer to the development of the brain. You look at it from the top down, well, actually bottom up, top down in hemispheres. So I don't want to steal your thunder. I just want you to set you up, putt the ball. Tell them everybody about that, please.
Yeah, so, with the development, in the early 90s when I first started doing this, it was declared the decade of the brain by Bill Clinton. So all this money and all this research went into brain research. And at that point, what was happening was that we were developing functional imaging of the brain, right? So for the first time, we could do more than just take a picture of the brain. We could actually measure it in real time. And things like QEEG, fMRI, PET scans, SPECT scans, magnetoencephalography. There were ways of really looking at the brain and understanding, what, and localizing where different functions were in the brain and how it came about. And it started to become aware that, again, the concept was that whenever we're looking at most neurological issues, they seem mysterious, meaning that we talk about chemical imbalances, but all of us kind of know that there's really no such thing as chemical imbalances in the brain, and you can't really measure chemical imbalances in the brain. Nobody really can measure that. So what we were talking about was something that we're looking at a symptom, whether it was, some sort of mental health issue or a tic or a movement disorder or vertigo or headaches, and we're saying, okay, we take an image of the brain, we don't see anything. But there's a problem, and the concept became known as functional connectivity, that the problem really was being seen as a functional connectivity problem. The way that we connect networks, the way that we communicate, that was where the problem was. It wasn't in a lesion in the brain. It wasn't a genetic problem per se, where there was a problem with a receptor system. And so that is really what led, again, part of the idea of functional neurology developing. And then when I first started really looking at it, I wanted to really look and say, okay, what was the cause? And I started working with children because my own son was diagnosed with ADHD. All of my 3 kids had different developmental issues, but they were also very gifted. And that's what the literature was talking about, something called an unevenness of skills, where people with ADHD weren't bad or delayed in everything. In fact, they were very gifted or even exceptional. And that was true for everything in the neurobehavioral realms: autism, Tourette's, OCD, dyslexia. They all had genius level skills in other areas. So the idea of looking at this functional disconnection between networks and understanding that there may be this imbalance in between the hemispheres that was relating to the symptoms, and that this all started in development. It all started in childhood or even in the womb or early development, and that was really related to especially motor and postural development, which resonated with me as a chiropractor at the time.
Outstanding. So functional disconnection syndrome, a concept that describes how brain function can be disrupted when the brain's hemispheres aren't working together properly. One of the reasons that you reference for ADHD. So that's the disconnection of the left and the right hemisphere.
Yeah, so, using ADHD as an example, we have, attention. We have 5 different forms of human attention. 4 of them are regulated primarily by the right brain, by what we call the ventral attention network, especially sustained attention. Broad attention, sustained attention that you need really to be successful in school and class and to be able to do anything for any length of time, right? So the classic ADHD is people have a problem with that attention span, but then there's the hyperactivity part. And we know that there's an area called Brodmann area 6, the premotor supplemental area on the left in the frontal lobe that is connected to the basal ganglia and the direct pathway. We know that if that's overactive, that causes an overactivity in the motor realm, and that causes either physically moving a lot or hyperactivity or repetitive movement or tics or stimming behavior. So we have overactivity of the network on the left side, which is that premotor supplemental motor area. We have a deficit on the right side of the same area on the right side, and that in combination produces an attention deficit and hyperactivity. And that is the way that I've come to look at everything, really from a neuroanatomical standpoint, and then understanding that even neurotransmitters are different. GABA, serotonin, and norepinephrine are more right hemisphere. Dopamine, glutamate, and acetylcholine are more left hemisphere. So looking at that imbalance as where the symptoms actually come from, so that is the root cause. But then you have to look at where does this imbalance come from and what causes that.
I heard you say on your TED Talk, good job, by the way, that you said that's actually 2 brains in one, that left and right side. So let's do a little quick rapid fire. We're 2 New York guys. We like rapid fire. People keep up with us. The right hemisphere, more sensory based.
Exactly.
Attention, more attributed to attention. Controls proprioception and posture. You want to give a definition for proprioception for everybody?
Yeah, it's basically being able to know where your body is in space and having a map that tells you where your body is and where you are relative to things around you.
Nonverbal communication is the right hemisphere. So my body language, people can tell I'm interested in what you have to say now. Socialization, big topic. Gut feeling, parasympathetic nervous system, digestion, leaky gut. Whereas the left hemisphere is vastly different when it comes to the gut. So that said, if I'm going to stimulate the vagus nerve, and we've had people talk about it, which side do I want to stimulate first?
That's a great question. And, traditionally, any sort of vagal nerve stimulation especially external vagal nerve, whether you're doing the ear or the carotid, or is usually done on the left side. Why is it done on the left side? Because they believe that that would be less disruptive to the heart and less likely to cause a heart attack or an arrhythmia. And actually, that's wrong, because the parasympathetic nervous system is more right-sided. So we know that when we're looking at an ipsilateral control mechanism of the brainstem and the brain, that the right side of the brain is more vagal, and it has more of an effect on the heart rate from the right side. And so, if you have and we also, some of the research suggests that when you're doing any sort of like that type of vagal stimulation, that it's an ipsilateral effect. So meaning if you have a problem with the right brain, or you have issues on the right side, like your blood pressure is higher on the right, or your oxygen is lower on the right, or you're sweating more on the right side, you want to actually do the vagal stim on the right side, right? Or if it's on the left, you may want to do it on the left. But all the research that's been done at this point is always on the left. So we've actually been talking to a couple of these manufacturers and saying, well, we want to actually study what happens when we do it on the right, not only for the nervous system in the brain, but also on the immune system, because we know that the main regulators of the immune response and of the Th1, Th2 system and inflammatory versus anti-inflammatory is really, the right and left brain regulates the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system.
Love it. So the right side is more parasympathetic. The left side is more sympathetic. The right hemisphere also suppresses the immune system, whereas the right side activates the immune system. So I wrote a book called Immune Reboot, and we talked about systems. I didn't talk about the balance of the brain. I missed that. So if you could take the football and run towards the end zone on that one for me, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, this is where a lot of our research is really going. I'd like to believe in the next 5 to 10 years. And there's some people leading the way. A guy named Kevin Tracy out of Long Island, actually out of North Shore Hospital, out of the institute there. He's been doing a lot of great work looking at neuroimmunology. Right now, neuroimmunology, or even in the past, all that really meant was, in most people, well, there's a leaky gut and there's inflammation, and that this inflammation goes to the brain and causes inflammation in the brain, and that may cause symptoms, right?
Right.
But it's actually a lot more complex than that. The brain actually takes the lead in the immune system, and it regulates the immune system, especially through the sympathetic and parasympathetic. But there's a lot of research now coming on looking at even sickness behavior, like being sick, getting a fever, malaise, all of that is really a parasympathetically mediated reflex. And if you cut the vagus nerve and you inject an animal with, an infective agent, they don't get a fever. They don't get sick, even though they're infected, right? And we see a lot of people like on the autism spectrum, they're sick, but they don't look sick. They don't feel sick, and they don't get a fever. And then sometimes if they get a fever, they actually speak. And it helps them. And that's because you're activating the parasympathetic and the right brain. And there's an area in the right brain called the insula, which is about interoception, proprioception. But there's a new term. It's called immunoception, meaning that the main central perception of what's happening in the immune system, what's happening with inflammation or triggering anti-inflammation, is registered in the insula and in areas of the brain, and the right side and the left side of the brain do that differently.
Great stuff. So here we have sort of like a triangle, if you will. I mean, when it doesn't work, it's Bermuda's Triangle, and when it works, it's a trifecta of health. You've got the gut right here, you've got your immune system right here, and you've got it all feeding to the brain right over here. So you talk about the brain immune axis and the gut immune axis, and you're being real specific. Interesting. So I always say gut to brain axis, brain to gut axis. So mucosal abnormalities, imbalanced gut flora, something you referred to, damages the intestinal barrier dysfunction. Essentially, systemic inflammation, neuroinflammation, neuroinvasion, neurodegeneration, also affecting the immune system. So the brain is the ultimate landing spot in the chip for virtually everything that we do. So why not keep it healthy, and why not keep it balanced?
Exactly. Yeah, because, ultimately, when I look at, my work and my research is really around brain development. And we know is that, almost all mental health issues, even in adults now, are being recognized that they all start in childhood. And they may not show up until they're in their 30s or 40s, or neurodegeneration may have actually started in childhood when you have reduced developmental trajectory. So if you have a slow slope in development, you get a faster dip at the end, so that we can look at, most, neurodevelopmental issues. And again, in almost all neurodevelopmental issues, there's also gut issues. There's leaky gut. I mean, most people don't realize that the whole gluten, dairy sensitivity all started in the autism community. That was started by parents and practitioners in the autism community 30, 40 years ago. And then it made its way into the mainstream, but it really started in that community. So, the the brain develops, as you said, from the bottom up, and it builds in layers, and it starts in the medulla, in the lower part of the brainstem. That's also where all the areas that comes from what's called primitive reflexes. And that's one of my main areas of research. And when that goes away, we also see that the nuclei that regulate the sympathetic and parasympathetic come from there. We start out with the sympathetic nuclei called the rostral ventral lateral medullary nucleus is on full alert when we're born, and it's inhibiting the dorsal motor nucleus. So our gut, when we're born, is open and leaky, and we're not producing a lot of acid or enzymes. And that's the way it's supposed to be when we're born, because we don't really have an adaptive immune system yet, and we get our antibodies from our mom's breast milk, and those are large proteins that wouldn't get through a normal, mature, tight stomach lining. So we start out with a leaky gut. Most people don't realize that. And then as the brainstem matures, as the reflexes go away, the nucleus ambiguus, which is the parasympathetic nuclei, develops in the ventral part of the medulla that inhibits the sympathetic nuclei. And now we start closing up the gut. We start producing acid and enzymes. We create the proper pH balance. We can kill off anything like mold or fungus or parasites that get through our mucous membranes. And we start to increase our blood flow so we absorb things. And that's the way that's supposed to happen. But if our reflexes don't go away, then our parasympathetic nervous system doesn't develop, and it doesn't inhibit the sympathetic, and someone stays in a sympathetic dominant state their whole life. And that's the foundation of leaky gut. That's the foundation of the digestive issues in many cases. And then that produces inflammation and all the things that we know. But most people don't realize that that initial problem starts with lack of maturity in the brainstem and in the brain, and in particular, especially the right side of the brain.
Fantastic. I mean, you just made, I always tell everybody, take that pen, write it down. We start with a leaky gut. The body's all interconnected. The gut to brain axis is the super highway to health. I agree with you 100% on autism. The data I've looked in gut is about 90% of people with autism have a leaky gut or a gut dysfunction. There was a good study that they did with mice. They added L-reuteri, and the ASD virtually ameliorated by giving L-reuteri. They removed the vagus nerve, they ripped it out, they doubled down on the L-reuteri, bang, all the ASD came back. So to really speak to the idea of a leaky gut and the vagus nerve communicating with the brain, I think they're great examples. I love your bottoms-up development issue in the brain because it refers to problems arising from disruptions in early development in the brain's lower regions, kind of like basic functions like sensory arousal, autonomic responses. What about the top-down?
Yeah, so initially, again, what really sets this all up is that the right brain is taking the lead in development in the first 3 years of life. So in the womb and for the first 3 years, the right brain is a little bit ahead of the left by about 20-30%. And so everything that's happening is influencing, and that is regulated by certain genes. We actually wrote a really cool paper on this last year on looking at the genes that regulate asymmetry. But most of what makes the right brain and the left brain isn't genetically mediated. It's mostly non-genetic and mostly environmental and based on experiences. But so whatever we're experiencing in the womb and in the first 3 years has more of an influence on the right brain and creates the specialization of the right brain. Then the left brain kicks in, and the left brain develops for the next 3 years. And so at the end of 6 years, this should be pretty balanced. And then they may shift a little bit, but for the most part, the foundation of the right brain and the foundation of the left brain are built, and then they just get more and more and more specialized, but they need to become more and more integrated and faster and quicker. And so that's where things can get disrupted. If something happens in the womb or affects development in the first 3 years, it has more of an impact on the right brain. If it happens later, it has more of an impact on the left brain. This is superimposed on all of us are a little bit more right brain or left brain dominant, and that runs in our families. And so all of this is happening. And so this is where the foundational problem starts. And that can be changed at any given point.
Fabulous. So the Melillo method incorporates all this. So how would you identify the ability to balance the brain or a lack of development and a lack of sync between the left and the right hemispheres? I know you have an order that you do.
Yeah, well, as you started, it really comes with functional measurements, right? So we actually the first thing we look at is really, even before development, people talk about prenatal movements. What is that? Prenatal movements are primitive reflexes. And primitive reflexes are there. First and foremost, the baby should automatically, get into the right position, upside down and backwards, and do that without getting the cord wrapped around their neck. And if they don't, if they're in a breech position, if they're not in the right position, if their cord's around the neck, then right off the bat, we know that those prenatal movements are not happening the way they're supposed to. That means the reflexes maybe not coming online the way they should. If they don't come online when they should, they don't go away when they should. And if they don't go away when they should, they keep the brain in a more immature state and lead to the imbalances. So what we see is that when a child is born, again, they should use these reflexes to get themselves out. If you need forceps or vacuum, it means that the baby isn't doing their job to push themselves out. I had one mom recently that was just here that, the baby was mostly out and the baby literally got sucked back up into her and they had to use a vacuum to get the baby out. Why would that happen? It happened because the baby wasn't doing their job at the end because they didn't have these reflexes there. And then the first milestone I look at is, can a baby latch on right away to the breast if a mom chooses to do that? 80-90% of the kids we work with, especially the non-speaking autism, they can't latch on from the beginning, which again shows that these reflexes and muscle tone. So we're looking at, all of these things and we're looking at, are they meeting these milestones? Do they have normal tone? Do they have asymmetry of tone? And if they do from the beginning, that asymmetry represents an asymmetric development of the brain, and that along with delayed development, that's what we call the bottom up and top down. Ultimately, when the brain builds, then it should come down and regulate everything. It regulates. It's the master of the immune system and the endocrine system and the digestive system and the hormone system. All of that should be regulated by the brain. And if that doesn't happen, then we can see disruptions in all of the systems of the body.
Amazing. So your method's effective for ADHD, OCD, tics, autism, bipolar, and imbalances in the brain in general. So before we go any further, let's give you a case study. Let's have some fun. Everybody knows I have congenital torticollis. Shortening of the SEM, pulls my head laterally to the right, contralaterally, turning to the opposite side. I had it at birth. My mom said when I was born, I was missing skin on my nose. It looked like I had a fight with the heavyweight champ, 2 black eyes, the whole bit. So I've gone through life with this asymmetry. I am now your patient. Let's talk.
Yep. So again, that's the first thing I would ask. And it's good that you know that a lot of adults don't really know, what happened during their birth, what was happening to the mom before birth, What was the birth process like? Were you in the right position? Was there any difficulty? So if you were not in the right position or there was difficulty and you had that level of bruising on you, then you probably were in a breech position. You may not have been in the right position. Certainly, you may have got stuck because you weren't. So right from the beginning, I'm thinking that you already had your primitive reflexes weren't coming online the way they should. And there's a lot of things we can talk about why they would happen. My third book, Autism, the Scientific Truth, is really not just about autism, but it's about what some of the epigenetic and genetic factors and preconception factors that can lead to this happening, right? But, and that we know puts a strain on the neck. And so did they have to use forceps or a vacuum on you in some way?
I think they did pull me out, my mom said, with the forceps. My dad
Yeah.
wasn't in the room, figures.
Yeah, so we know that causes an injury. So one of the things when I did my first textbook, Neurobehavioral Disorders, again, I was looking at the postural development and especially the neck, especially the upper part of the neck, is really the driver of brain development more than anything else. And that's why, doing adjustments to the neck or problems with the neck early on can really have an impact. And so one of the statistics I came across was that 28,000 times a year, as a normal course of birth in the United States, 28,000 times a year, children die from decerebrate births. What does that mean? It means just by pulling on their head too hard, we separate their spinal cord from their brainstem and they instantly die, right? So that tells you that the neck is pretty gentle. And then there were some studies. There was an osteopath years ago that did a number of studies looking at what he called KISS syndrome, kinematic imbalance syndrome. And he showed that many kids had torticollisis, but he also showed that many kids, even kids that died of SIDS, that when you did autopsies, they had petechiae or bruising in the ligaments of their upper cervical spine, which he postulated was that they had an injury to their neck at birth. And that may have in some way affected them and maybe have, had something to do with them dying early. So we know that it happens during birth. I mean, I see a number of kids that we work with that have torticollis at birth. Again, it's the shortening of the muscles happens over time. So the key to that, like anything else, is you want to try to change it early. And, adjustments are the best way to do that. And then exercises, physical therapy is done very commonly and it can be very successful. But when there's this imbalance, the feedback into the brain from the beginning is already disrupted, right? And what we see is that typically right-sided tilts usually have more of an impact on the right brain or represent more of a right brain delay. If we see a left, we see left brain. So what I would do with you is say, okay, if I go through the course of your life, first of all, I want to know, are you more of a right brain or left brain dominant person? And what were you like as a kid? What were you like in school? Did you excel academically? Were you good? Did you struggle with school in any way?
I'm more right-sided brain without question. It's very interesting. There were times where I was at the top of the class and other times I was at the bottom of the class. There was a tremendous inconsistency. One thing my mom said when I was born, neck was tilted straight into 2, then when tilted again, been that way my whole life.
Right.
So they probably tore the muscles.
Maybe, or they never really dealt with the problem, right? I don't know what type of treatment you had from the physiotherapy, but if you didn't have...
There was no treatment. I mean,
the only thing that's going to change that is really chiropractic treatment or a really good physical therapist that really understands, manipulation. That's the only thing that's really going to help that. And if you didn't have that, and back in the older days, they didn't do that. And so once that is fixed, we know you have fixation in the spine and it doesn't resolve itself, right? You need to do something to change it. And over time, bone will remodel, joints will remodel, muscles will remodel, and then it can become permanent, or then it can become very difficult to reverse. But when you say you're right side dominant, so, and again, just in school, how were you at reading? Were you good at reading when you were
a good reader, a good test taker, stuff like that?
Okay, you were good at spelling?
Horrible at spelling.
Okay. And so reading, were you good Were you a fast reader or a slow reader?
I
Would
was
you
a fast reader.
fast reader? Okay. And what about math? How were you in math, like
My
basic math?
aptitude is math, without question. I
All
went to
right,
a
that's
specialized high
interesting.
school. Yeah.
Okay. And then what about how were you? Were you into sports? Were
I
you
was.
athletic?
I played. I did. I played sports, but because my neck is not straight, I had to learn how to shoot the ball because I couldn't square my shoulder in basketball. So I
Right,
have a very unique spin, if you will. Interesting.
right. And were you a social person? Do you consider yourself
I'm an
really good at
extrovert.
reading? So you're an extrovert. You're good at reading people. Do you do any, did you do any creative pursuits like music or art or design?
Tone
Um,
deaf. Tone deaf.
what would you say your best trait is, your best ability, your whole life?
It is definitely to read people. You know, growing
Okay.
up in New York, in New York City, you get to read people really fast.
Okay, so that's a classic right brain skill, right? Nonverbal communication, reading people, reading words, reading books is a left brain skill. Reading people is really a right brain skill. The right brain is primarily driven by socialization and human attachment
Mm.
and attachment to our own body, regulation, emotional regulation, attachment in general. I don't know if you've ever read any work by Alan Shore or
Mm.
other people in the psychiatry and psychology world like Dan Siegel, Lou Cozolino, who talk a lot about, right brain therapy and look at right brain development. It's just, we know that right brain is really responsible for that attachment. And so, connecting and reading other people, people that are very right brain dominant, like my daughter is a singer songwriter, and she struggled with anxiety or overreading socially, overreading people's facial expression. There's studies on kids with dyslexia that show that they have overactivity of the salience network, which is a network that pays attention, especially looking at facial expression. So they overread that, and that causes a stress response in their body and causes anxiety. They overread facial expression and they automatically assume that people are judging them negatively. The right brain, is has what we call rejection sensitivity and embarrassment and shame and guilt are right brain emotions. So those are things that are very strong with people that are very right brain dominant, and that is also paralyzed. That can be paralyzing, and that is often the foundation of bipolarism
Mm.
and depression.
Interesting. So I have a question for you. Brain neurogenesis, the process of generating new neurons in the brain, which occurs throughout the life. For our followers, for our listeners, what do you recommend to help with brain neurogenesis?
Well, there's actually only been a few studies that have ever shown what actually generates neurogenesis in adult humans.
Mm.
The only studies at this point in mice and adults that have shown to actually effectively do it is running. So running is the only exercise that we know of for sure. But it basically means motor activity, right? So movement, motor activity, moving your body and doing it in more and more challenging ways or complex ways is going to be the number one way to create neurogenesis in the brain. But then there are probably other ways, and I'm sure obviously diet and nutrition plays a role of it because you're creating new material and proteins and everything like that. But if you look in the literature, the only thing that's ever been obviously proven to create neurogenesis is actually running and more long distance running.
No weight training. Interesting. So brain neurogenesis, would you say, or would it be fair to say that it's the brain's ability to grow new neurons?
Yeah, it's the ability to generate new neurons. And again, we used to believe that that wasn't possible, and
Correct.
that if you injured brain tissue, but about 20 years ago, especially out of Rutgers, the first studies were done looking at neurogenesis. And again, they were done in rice and in California. Well, they were done in mice, and they showed that putting them on a running wheel. Now, because that's motor activity, I believe that exercise like lifting weights and things like that is also going to be very effective. But I'm not aware of any research right now that shows that lifting weights or anything creates neurogenesis, but I would say that it probably does.
Neuroplasticity, the ability of the nervous system to change its activity in response to intrinsic or extrinsic stimuli by reorganizing structural function, connections after injuries. neuroplasticity. How can our followers get some neuroplasticity?
Well, the father of neuroplasticity is a guy named Mike Mersnick, and he was also there's a group that was out of Berkeley in the 70s that really started the foundational work of looking at neuroplasticity and being able to change the brain. And it means that through specific activity, or they did studies where they put rats or mice in what they called an impoverished environment where they didn't have running wheels and they didn't have a lot going on and there were no toys for them to play with and they just sat in a blank cage. And then they put other animals in a exciting environment with running wheels and toys and things like that. And they showed that the mice or rats in those cages had a lot more connections in their neurons and that their neurons grew bigger and thicker. And so the idea that we could, through stimulating and having a stimulating environment, that we could actually change brain function and brain connectivity, and that the more connections we have, or the more efficient those connections are, the better the brain is going to work, and the faster it works. And and that's true. We know that by activating the brain and by doing things like using a muscle, the more we use our muscle, the bigger it grows. The more we use our brain, it literally physically, the neurons grow larger. The larger they are, the faster they can conduct impulses, the faster the brain waves become, the more connections they form, and the stronger those connections are. And the more that the brain is integrated and connected, the more parts of the brain we can bring together. And everything in the brain is about speed and efficiency. Anything that takes that away is obviously not good. So that's the principles of neuroplasticity, and it's mainly a use it or lose it principle, but it can be specific. And there has to be a very specific stimuli for specific function in the brain. It has to be done repetitively. It has to be done at a certain frequency and intensity for neuroplasticity to happen. So just saying that, well, with neuroplasticity, there are certain principles, rehab principles you have to apply to actually achieve that.
Fascinating stuff. Brain neurogenesis, neuroplasticity. I mean, when you started, there was no such thing, and now it's at the tip of every functional neurologist's tongue. I'm going to throw out some brain supplements for neuroplasticity. Comment as you like. Omega-3 fatty acids.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of my main go-tos. I mean, I take omega-3s in high doses every day. I recommend it for every patient pretty much. I think that it's very important for reducing inflammation and for supporting fatty acid and myelin growth and all of that.
Turmeric.
Turmeric is very powerful because it obviously is a very powerful anti-inflammatory. It has an effect on the Th2 system and on the Th17 system. So it dampens. Quercetin and turmeric are two very powerful to dampen the overactivity of B cells and antibodies and reduce inflammation.
Yeah, and they also decrease NF-kappa B. Great takeaway. Magnesium L-threonate.
Well, magnesium is very good because we know it seems to have an effect on dampening the sympathetic nervous system, right? So it dampens that sympathetic response. Therefore, it may, lower blood pressure, allow people to sleep better, and it may actually also reduce inflammation. And I think it's mainly having an effect on the sympathetic nervous system, which means that it has to in some way promote parasympathetic activity.
Medium chain triglycerides and ketone bodies.
Yeah, well, medium chain triglycerides, again, like omega-3 fatty acids, are very important. And when we look at ketosis, I've been studying ketosis for a long time because I've been working with kids for a long time. And again, most people don't realize that the whole idea of the ketogenic diet started in the 40s in Johns Hopkins to work with kids with seizures, right? So it started for seizures. And in children. So, that's where it started. So I've been familiar with it for a long time, but no one really could explain why it works so much. And what we do know, the short story is that it seems to repair mitochondrial damage or mitochondrial lack of use. So when you don't use your brain properly, when you're underactive, understimulated, or immature, you're not going to stimulate as much mitochondrial development or use. And so therefore you get fatigability, and fatigability can lead to damage and excitotoxicity in the brain. And so what it appears that, ketones actually help to repair mitochondria chain, and also help to help with, oxygen utilization in muscles.
I agree with you with the mitochondria. My understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the brain is the most mitochondria enriched organ in the body. I mean, there's an argument between the heart and the kidney. Mitochondrial dysfunction is the backbone for, or I should say, really the bane of many of our existences. Mitochondrial dysfunction go hand in hand with leaky gut. Both of them combined also decrease the GLP-1 signaling, which we can go and discuss another day. You mentioned excitotoxicity. I understand that taurine's great, but because it enables you to decrease or close the synaptic cleft. So maybe we should put taurine in our protocol. That just came to mind. But that's great. When you're looking at mitochondria, people don't realize that it's not just ATP. It also has a secondary function where it helps the innate immune system, and that's interesting now that you mentioned that. So the brain's dysfunctional, mitochondria, immune system. Why don't you take the baton with that one?
Yeah, so, again, it all comes down a lot to looking at the activation of brain cells and what we call, gene regulation, and activating genes that regulate the development of the brain. And when we're looking at neuroplasticity, when you increase the size of a neuron, you increase the firing rate, you increase connections, you're increasing the metabolic demand. So to have that happen and meet that metabolic demand, you need to increase the production of energy. And so mitochondria can literally replicate and reproduce. They're one of the only organelles that can do that in the cell. And so if something interferes with that, or alters that, or if we're not activating the cell, then what happens is we lose mitochondria. And then if we're trying to get our cells to do more than they're capable of, and they don't have the oxygen to support it, in brain cells, in muscles, we get sore when we exceed our oxygen consumption, right? And that's okay. In the brain, if we exceed our oxygen ability, we kill them. So, and that is really where we see kind of excitotoxicity. We're seeing that we start getting leakiness to calcium. And this is often because the membranes aren't stable and they're not active. And, there's an overactivation of the sympathetic nervous system. And we say stress can lead to that. So all of that impacts the brain and the cell's ability to do work and to provide oxygen. And if we're trying to exceed that, and we try to, we go beyond it, we think beyond what our brain's capacity is, we end up causing damage. And then that can really cascade, and eventually that can cause, the tau proteins and neurodegeneration and all of that.
So I want to close with, and I always close with, 3 takeaways that my friend in Switzerland can implement to have a better brain or a better brain balance. The floor is yours.
It all starts with brain development. So you need to go back in anybody, adult or child or yourself, and look at your brain development and look at, did it happen in the most optimal way? Was there something like you that may have created a brain injury, or, was there other issues? And then you need to go back and look at that. Everybody should be screened to look if they have retained primitive reflexes, and those need to go away first and foremost. The other thing is understanding your natural brain dominance profile. So are you more of a right brain or left brain dominant people? The organ that people know least about in their body is their own brain. And that is the most important organ. It really controls everything, every thought, every function, everything that happens in your body really starts in your brain. So you need to understand, are you naturally more of a right brain or left brain dominant person? And then, do you have any weaknesses that you need to work on? And do you have any imbalances that may be responsible for anything that you're struggling with? Whether it's mentally, emotionally, or physically, all of that, it can be initiated by the brain itself. So physical activity is the most important thing for changing the brain, but then diet is the second thing that's most important. You need to look at all of those things, and you should get, an idea of your own blood work to see where you may have deficiencies. So looking at primitive reflexes, doing physical activity that can help resolve the reflexes, but add core stability and balance to your body and your posture especially. And then look at your own biochemistry and get yourself on the best diet possible. So, if people want to learn more, I think the first thing they should do is go to look at my book, Disconnected Kids. The third edition from Penguin just came out this past summer, so it's really updated with a lot of our research. I've written over 100 scientific papers, and a lot of that has been in the last few years. So there's a lot of updated information there, and it's been translated into 18 languages. So I would get people to start with that.
Outstanding. This has been a pleasure. I know you're short on time. I appreciate you coming on. And so everybody knows, Dr. Melillo has a new patient. He's going to get a call in the next 60 seconds, and it's going to be from me. He's going to help me with my issues and many others. So I appreciate your time. Dr. Rob Melillo, appreciate it. Proven Health
Thank you.
Alternatives.